We've got some major buffs coming our way in the next weekly reset for Retail WoW. So in this video, we'll be going over the latest patch notes and see which specs are getting some love because, man, Ret Paladins and Holy Priest stonks are going to be going way up after this. So we'll start off with Blood Death Knights, and it looks like they're going to be getting a Bone Shield buff that's now going to be granting armor based on 80% of your strength from 70, so that's a 10% increase there. And while that might seem like a minor buff here, that's actually pretty big in my opinion. While Blood DKs are already doing really well in the raid, I feel like this buff is going to help them a lot in Mythic Plus. When we look at Frost Death Knights, it's looking like they're going to be getting a 4% increase to all of their damage dealt. And again, when people look at this, they're just going to see that 4%, they're going to be like, that's tiny. But you guys got to remember, that's like all damage dealt. A 4% increase to all of your damage dealt is like getting a huge upgrade from your Grade Vault. So that's pretty good. And then for Unholy, it looks like they're getting the same treatment here. So all damage dealt by you and your pet's abilities increased by 4%. And this is good to see. Both Frost and Unholy kind of needed some love as far as buffs go with their damage output. I'll be real curious to see where they fall in the rankings after this update. Moving on to Feral Druids. So Feral's getting some pretty big buffs here. Rip damage is being increased by 10%, Rake's periodic damage is being increased by 5%, Primal Wrath's damage increased by 10%, Feral Frenzy's damage increased by 5%, Lunar Inspiration damage increased by 10%, and then Rampant Ferocity's damage is being increased by 25%. These buffs to Feral are definitely warranted. When it comes to Feral's damage, they're not performing really well in pretty much all aspects of the game. If you look at the rankings on Subcreation for the raid on Mythic, they're a C tier spec, and then for Mythic Plus on all affixes, they're all the way down in the F tier. So these buffs are definitely going to help Feral increase their damage output and make them a little bit more relevant, especially in the raid. However, like everyone knows with Mythic Plus, damage is not everything, so it'll be really interesting to see just how much of an impact this buff is going to be on them for Mythic Plus. For Restoration Druid, they're going to be getting some really minor buffs here, but I think they're still pretty substantial. So Swift Mend is now going to cost 1.4% base mana, down from 1.6. Grove Guardian now costs 1% base mana from 1.2%. Wild Growth now costs 3.8% base mana from 4%. Regrowth now costs 2.8% base mana from 3.2%. And then Effervescence now costs 3% base mana from 3.2%. So again, these are all pretty minor buffs for Restoration Druid. It looks like for these spells specifically, you're going to be using just a little bit less mana for them. It looks like Survival Hunter is getting some love here from Blizzard, so all damage dealt by Hunter and their pet's abilities is being increased by 4%, and very similar to Frost and Unholy Death Knights, this is definitely needed. Survival Hunters are kind of lacking in the damage department. However, that could just be a case of not a lot of people that are very good at playing Hunter are playing this spec, so that's why the spec is kind of trending on the lower end of tier lists. But what's really interesting about this one is, unlike the Frost and Unholy Death Knight buffs, these are actually going to be increased by 4% in not only PvE, but also PvP. So who knows, maybe you might see some more Survival Hunters showing up in Battlegrounds. For all of you PvPers that are like, I think there's maybe like 20 of you left. Next up, we've got Holy Paladins. So Shield of Righteousness damage is being increased by 30%, and Consecration's damage is being increased by, again, 30%. So some pretty substantial buffs to Holy Paladins damage output, so that's really nice to see. For Ret Paladins, we've got Wake of Ashes damage is being increased by 20%, Truth's Wake damage increased by 28%, Seething Flames damage increased by 28%, Blade of Justice damage increased by 20%, and Final Verdict damage increased by 10%. So these buffs to Ret Paladin are kind of wild in my opinion. They're already performing really well in both Mythic Plus and the Mythic Raid, so with these buffs added onto that, I think Ret Paladins are just going to be flying through the roof. So moving on to Holy Priest. Holy Word Sanctifies, healing increased by 25%, Heals, healing increased by 25%, Flash Heals, healing increased by 15%, Holy Word Chastise, damage increased by 30%, Smites damage increased by 30%, and Shadow Word Pains damage increased by 15%. So it looks like we've got some pretty substantial buffs to Holy Priests here. This one's going to be pretty interesting because in Mythic Plus, they're, I guess, kind of like a middle of the pack performing healer as far as, you know, the rankings goes, but for the raid they're kind of on the bottom side. So again, some really good changes here to Holy Priests. I think we're definitely going to see some more of them showing up in Mythic Plus and also the raid. Next up, we've got Shadow Priest. So Mind Blast damage increased by 10%, Devouring Plague damage increased by 10%, Shadowy Apparition damage increased by 20%, and then Psychic Link damage increased by 5%. So to me, it looks like Blizzard has realized that maybe they nerfed Shadow Priests just a little too much, and they're trying to, I guess, bring them back kind of to where they were before, albeit with, you know, maybe just not as much crazy utility as they had before. For Restoration Shamans, it looks like all healing is being increased by just 5%, Lava Burst damage increased by 20%, Flame Shock damage increased by 20%, and then Lightning Bolt damage increased by 20%. This one's pretty interesting to me. I think these buffs are definitely targeted towards their performance in Mythic Plus, because, you know, nowadays everything when it comes to healers is just all about how much damage they can do, which I think is really stupid in my opinion, and, you know, that's definitely going to be a topic for a video for another day. Okay, moving on to Arms Warriors. So Cleave damage is being increased by 10%, Dreadnought damage increased by 30%, Deep Wounds damage increased by 15%, and then for the Amir Driscoll 4-piece set bonus damage for the triggered Thunderclap increased by 100%. So Arms is another one of those specs that definitely needed some love. In my opinion, I think they could have used some more buffs. If you look at them currently on the sub-creation tier list for the raid, they're D tier, and then for Mythic Plus, they're F tier. So Arms is definitely one of those specs that needs some love. Prot Warriors are also getting some buffs here. So Vanguard now grants a 40% increase to stamina from 35%, so a 5% buff there. And then Ignore Pain's absorption is being increased by just a flat 5%. So those are all of the quote-unquote PvE changes. Now let's talk about the PvP ones. So we've got Cloth Spec classes now gain an additional 35% armor in arenas and battlegrounds. Plate Spec classes now have their armor reduced by 30% in arena and battlegrounds. The Gladiator's Distinction 2-piece set bonus now increases the stamina by 15% from 5% for damage dealer and tank rolls. And then the 2-piece set bonus for healers, the stamina is being increased by 5%. All fear and root effects in PvP now take 100% more damage before canceling. For Unholy Death Knights, it looks like Festering Wound damage was just doing a little bit too much damage because it's getting nerfed by 15%. Death Coil's damage is getting nerfed by 10%. And then the Necrotic Wound now absorbs 3% of healing received, down from 4%. For Balanced Druids, it looks like the armor you get from Wound Conform is being nerfed by 25%. Deep Roots increases the amount of damage required to cancel Entangling Roots or Mass Entangle by 75% from 250%. So a massive nerf there. It looks like it'll be a little bit easier to get out of those things in PvP. For Feral Druids, Frenzied Regeneration is no longer being decreased by 20%, so a nice little buff to the healing there. The Mana Regeneration for Restoration Druids is now being reduced by 50% from 45%, and then the healing is being reduced by 5% overall in just all PvP. For mages, Rigid Ice increases the amount of damage required to cancel Frost Nova by 20% from 80%, and then the 4-piece set bonus for Frost is no longer being reduced in PvP. For Windwalker Monks, the 2-piece set bonus effectiveness is being reduced by 80% from 60%. For Discipline Priests, the 2-piece set bonus effectiveness is no longer being reduced in PvP. For Subtlety Rogues, Eviscerate damage is being reduced by 10%. For Restoration Shamans, your armor is being reduced by 12.5%. For Warlocks, Nightmare increases the amount of damage required to cancel Fear by 30%, and that was originally 60%. And then for Fury Warriors, Anger Management now reduces Recklessness and Ravager's cooldown by 1 second per 15 rage spent from 20. And that is it for these patch notes. It looks like some of these specs are definitely going to be getting some pretty big changes, and I know it's going to be really interesting to see, where these classes are going to be in the meta going forward. If you guys enjoyed this video, let me know by hitting that like button and subscribe to the channel as well. Also, before you go, let me know in the comments section what your thoughts are on all of these changes. Thanks again for watching. I'm still Solo, and I'll see you guys later.